The morning air carried the kind of quiet that only comes after years of saying nothing. David poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, while Emma folded Sophie's school sweater, her hands trembling slightly as if memory had weight. The radio murmured the news until one voice cut through. A car crash on Millstone Highway. 2 passengers critical. David froze, the mug clinking against the counter, eyes widening as familiar names echoed from the reporter's tone. He hadn't heard their voices in 11 years, yet the world suddenly felt too small for distance. Emma whispered his name, but silence pressed harder. What would you say to someone who stopped waiting for you? The drive to the ambulance station felt longer than it should. The sky was pale, heavy with clouds that refused to break. Emma sat beside him in silence, her fingers tracing invisible circles on her knee. David's phone buzzed again, the dispatcher's voice repeating details of the crash, his parents' names. His pulse thudded in his ears. He thought of the last words Richard spoke to him. "You're no son of mine." The road blurred, the world narrowing into a single choice. Turn back, or face the ghosts still breathing. At the station, the smell of antiseptic and coffee mixed in the cold air. David slipped into his uniform, boots thudding against concrete. His partner asked if he was ready, but the answer stayed trapped behind clenched teeth. Every sound felt louder. Sirens, chatter, the click of his badge. Emma stood by the doorway, her hands pressed together like prayer. When he glanced at her, she gave the smallest nod, the kind that says, "Go do what your heart won't let you ignore." The radio in the ambulance crackled with static as they sped toward the highway. Rain thickened against the windshield, wipers slicing rhythmically through the storm. David's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. The dispatcher's voice faded in and out, but he didn't need to hear it. He already knew. The past was waiting for him in twisted metal and broken glass. For a moment, he whispered a name under his breath, not sure if it was prayer or punishment. Back home, Emma sat in the stillness he left behind. The house hummed with echoes, the clink of mugs, the sound of Sophie's pencil scratching on homework. Every thunderclap outside drew her eyes to the window. She imagined him there on that road, facing the people who broke him. The clock ticked louder, time mocking her patience. Somewhere between fear and hope, she whispered, "Bring them home." The memory began like an ember, small, warm, and dangerous. David stood at the old Morgan estate, his palms damp as he waited to speak. The air smelled of wine and polished wood, the same room where he once celebrated every success. His parents sat across the table, expectation in their eyes. He told them he'd met someone, that she was kind and real, that he loved her. The silence afterward was heavier than anger. Richard's voice cracked first, cold, final, a blade hidden in pride. And just like that, the sun they raised vanished into the space between words. Richard's words rolled like thunder through the room. "She's beneath you, David. You have no idea what you're throwing away." Margaret tried to interject, voice trembling, but pride always spoke louder. David didn't shout, he simply stood, the silence more cutting than rage. Every heartbeat pounded against the walls lined with framed degrees and family portraits. When he walked out, he left the door open, the kind of exit that made the house feel colder forever. Outside, the night air was sharp, tasting of rain. David leaned against his car, the first tear falling before he could stop it. In his pocket, Emma's message blinked. "How did it go?" He couldn't answer. Behind him, lights flickered off one by one until the house stood dark, unwelcoming. He turned the key in the ignition and drove toward a life that would never fit their image, but might finally fit his heart. Weeks passed, but the distance felt older than time. Margaret wrote a letter she never sent. Richard worked longer hours, polishing his loneliness with duty. At a small cafe downtown, Emma waited, hands wrapped around a paper cup. When David finally arrived, she saw it all in his eyes. The pain, the loss, the quiet freedom. She reached for his hand, and for the first time in days, he let himself breathe. Their wedding was small, No chandeliers, no violins, no family seating chart. Just vows whispered under an oak tree, witnessed by wind and truth. Emma's eyes glistened. David's hands shook. But the moment felt right. Somewhere miles away, Richard poured another drink, and Margaret watched old photographs with trembling fingers. Love had chosen its side, and the silence that followed would last more than a decade. Rain lashed the highway like a punishment. The sky refused to end. David's hands stayed steady on the wheel, but his heartbeat betrayed him. Every curve of the road blurred through wipers that couldn't keep up. The dispatch repeated coordinates, and his gut clenched. It was the same stretch his family drove home from every Sunday dinner years ago. The storm howled, and inside the ambulance, time folded. He wasn't a son or a medic now, just a man chasing the echo of what he'd lost. The wreck came into view. Metal twisted like paper, headlights still flickering weakly. David slammed the brakes, boots splashing into mud before the vehicle stopped moving. He shouted commands, but his voice trembled when he saw the license plate. The name burned in his throat before it escaped. Morgan. He staggered forward, disbelief giving way to dread. For years, he imagined seeing them again. Never like this. David crawled toward the passenger side, every movement fighting against rain and memory. His gloves slipped on the wet metal as he forced the door open. Margaret's head turned weakly, eyes fluttering open, searching through the blur. For a second, she didn't know him. And then she did. Her lips trembled around a single word. His name. The storm roared louder to hide her tears, but not his. He found Richard pinned under the steering wheel, breathing shallowly. The man who once called him a stranger now clung to life by a thread. David braced himself, shouting for Eli, using every ounce of training to forget who this was, but every command cracked with emotion. When Richard opened his eyes, confusion and pain blurred together. "David," he rasped. The storm outside seemed to pause, listening. They worked through the night. Cuts, straps, glass, fire, all blurred into one heartbeat. Margaret was lifted first, her hand brushing David's sleeve as she whispered something he couldn't yet process. Then Richard's turn came, and when David lifted him, the older man gasped, clutching at his son's shoulder like anchor and apology at once. In that moment, David stopped being their outcast. He was simply their son and their savior. The storm finally broke as the ambulance doors slammed shut. Inside, David worked without thinking, hands moving on instinct, pressure here, breath there, life measured by seconds. Richard's pulse flickered beneath his fingers, faint but stubborn. Margaret stirred, whispering fragments of his name. The radio buzzed with hospital ETA, yet all David could hear was the sound of 11 lost years unraveling one heartbeat at a time. For the first time, duty and love were the same thing. The hospital lights were too bright, too clean to belong to this story. David followed the gurneys through automatic doors, boots squeaking on linoleum. Nurses took over, and in an instant, the people he had saved disappeared behind curtains. He stood motionless, heart pounding, drenched uniform sticking to his back. Around him, strangers moved with urgency while he drowned in stillness. For years, he'd prepared for this, to save lives, but never imagined saving theirs. Hours passed. David sat in the waiting area, drenched jacket folded beside him. Every tick of the clock clawed at his nerves. He thought of calling Emma, but words refused to form. Across from him, a nurse approached, asking his relation to the patients. For a moment, he hesitated. The lie almost easier than the truth. Then he said it, softly but certain. "They're my parents." The words cracked something open that the years had sealed shut. When Emma arrived, the automatic doors sighed open, and time began again. She crossed the sterile floor with urgency, eyes red from tears that refused to wait. David stood, and for a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the night clung to both of them. Fear, relief, disbelief. She reached up and touched his cheek, wiping away the storm still clinging there. "You did what you were meant to do," she whispered. He nodded, though his eyes said he wished it hadn't taken this long. "How?" A nurse finally approached, voice low but kind. "They would live?" The relief came quietly, not in shouts but in tears that neither could hold back. David sank into the chair beside Emma, their fingers entwined. The hallway outside filled with sunrise, washing the white walls in pale gold. He thought of everything left unsaid, the years stolen by pride and silence. Somewhere behind a curtain his parents breathed, fragile proof that fate sometimes gives second chances. The first light of morning poured through the blinds, painting lines across Richard's hospital bed. Machines whispered beside him, steady and merciful. Margaret sat at his side, her fingers resting on the blanket, eyes fixed on the door as if afraid to hope. When it finally opened, David stepped inside. No uniform, no mask, just the sun they had erased. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Margaret spoke, her voice breaking like something released after years of silence. "You came back. He almost said I never left." Richard stirred, trying to speak. Words came out like sandpaper, caught between guilt and disbelief. "You saved us?" David nodded, but his expression carried no pride, only sorrow. "It's what I do," he said quietly. The truth hung there. He had spent years saving strangers because he couldn't save what mattered. Richard's throat tightened. Pride, once his armor, now his punishment. Margaret's hand slipped into her son's, the same warmth that once held him as a child. Time softened, and the room filled with something close to peace. Later, in the hallway, Emma stood outside the glass window with Sophie, watching quietly. She'd never met them, only seen the damage they caused in David's silence. Now she saw two fragile figures who looked smaller than the stories made them. Sophie tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Is that Grandpa and Grandma?" Emma smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "but let's wait until they remember what that means." The child's reflection lingered in the glass, like the future gently touching the past. That evening, the doctors cleared Richard for limited movement. David wheeled him slowly into the courtyard where twilight softened everything cruel. Margaret walked beside them, her hand brushing David's shoulder occasionally, unsure if she had the right to comfort him. Richard looked up at the sky, exhaling deeply. "I spent years believing I was right," he said. David didn't answer. He didn't need to. The air between them carried forgiveness not through words, but through being there at all. Night settled over the hospital, quiet except for the rhythmic beep of machines. David stood alone at the window, watching city lights blink like distant stars. Emma appeared beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "They'll come home one day," she said softly. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. In the reflection, their faces overlapped. The man who left and the man who returned, now one and the same. Outside, the rain began again, but this time it sounded like something cleansing, not breaking. Weeks passed before the visit. The morning air was soft, the kind that carries both fear and hope. David's truck rolled into the long driveway of the Morgan house, a place that once belonged to pride, now waiting for grace. Emma sat beside him, her hand resting over his, while Sophie pressed her face to the window. The house hadn't changed, but everything inside them had. David exhaled slowly, the weight of years turning to breath. "Let's go home," he said, though the word finally meant something new. Margaret opened the door first, her trembling hands clutching the frame as if afraid it might all disappear. She looked at Emma, then Sophie, and her breath caught. The family she once refused was standing in her doorway. "You must be Emma," she whispered. Emma nodded, her voice steady. "And this is Sophie." The little girl smiled shyly, offering a small wildflower she had picked from the garden. Margaret took it, and in that simple exchange, years of distance dissolved like dust in sunlight. Richard waited in the living room, cane by his side. When David entered, their eyes locked, No thunder, no anger, just recognition of everything they had both lost. Richard tried to stand, his legs weak, but his resolve firm. "You shouldn't have had to be the one to save me," he said. David shook his head. "Maybe I needed to." They stayed there, two men bound by love's unfinished work, saying everything without saying much at all. Sophie wandered through the hall, pointing at framed photos of a younger David. Graduation, family trips, moments from a world she never knew. "That's you?" she asked. He smiled softly, nodding. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances, realizing how much of their son they'd missed watching her grow. Margaret whispered, "She has your eyes." David looked at his parents, voice low but certain. "She has all of us now." The room filled with quiet laughter, the kind that finally sounded like family. As evening fell, the Morgans gathered in the backyard under fading light. Emma helped set the table. Margaret brought out tea. Richard poured lemonade, his hands still shaking but determined. Sophie laughed at a joke David barely finished, the sound carrying through the yard like a promise. For the first time in years, the silence that once haunted them became a gentle quiet, the kind that exists only when everyone finally belongs. The table was smaller than it used to be, but somehow it felt big enough for everyone now. The old silverware clinked softly, plates mismatched, candles flickering in the gentle air. David carved the roast with hands steadier than his heart, while Margaret watched him with quiet wonder. Richard reached for a dish, his hand brushing Emma's. She smiled kindly, no bitterness in her eyes. Sophie passed bread to her grandfather as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For once the Morgans ate in silence that healed instead of hurt. After dinner, they lingered. No one rushed to fill the silence. Margaret poured tea, the steam curling between them like a slow forgiveness. Richard cleared his throat, searching for words that had waited too long. "I thought love had rules," he said. "Turns out it only has consequences when you forget what it's for." David met his gaze, not as a son needing approval, but as a man offering peace. "We can start again," he said simply. Richard nodded, tears shining brighter than the lamp beside him. Later, Margaret led Sophie into the old study, showing her shelves of books and framed certificates once symbols of pride. "He was brilliant, you know," she said softly, pointing to David's graduation photo. Sophie grinned. "He still is." Margaret's eyes filled again, not with guilt this time, but gratitude. She hugged the girl, a bridge between past and present. Down the hall, Richard watched quietly, hand tightening on his cane as if holding himself together with humility alone. Outside, the evening air smelled of rain and soil, fresh from renewal. David and Richard stood on the porch beneath dim light, silence stretching but no longer painful. "You built a good life," Richard said at last. David nodded. "You taught me to fight for what matters, even when I had to fight you." They both smiled faintly, the kind that comes only when both sides have lost enough to understand winning differently. When they left, the porch light stayed on, not as a farewell, but a welcome left burning. Margaret waved from the doorway, Richard beside her, arm draped lightly across her shoulder. David held Emma's hand while Sophie skipped ahead, humming softly to herself. The car door closed, but no goodbyes were spoken. Only the kind of silence that means everything's finally right. As they drove off, David looked once more in the mirror, the house shrinking behind them, light still glowing through rain. Home, at last. No longer a place, but a choice kept.